The rain in the city didn't feel like water anymore. It felt like a cold, heavy sheet that refused to lift. For the 10-year-old girl whose shoes were letting in dirty water with every step, the weather was just another thing to endure. She didn't have a name tag on her jacket, and to the people rushing past, she didn't have a name at all. She was just part of the gray scenery, a smudge on the busy sidewalk that everyone tried to avoid looking at. Her jacket was too thin for the season. It had been a hand-me-down once, maybe years ago, but now it was just a collection of holes and frayed fabric. She pulled it tighter around her small frame, but the wind found its way through the gaps anyway, biting at her skin. She shivered, a constant rhythmic trembling that she had learned to ignore mostly, except when it made her teeth chatter. She found her usual spot. It was a recessed doorway in a tall brick building, offering at least a few inches of protection from the wind. She sat down on a piece of cardboard that she had scavenged from a dumpster behind a grocery store 2 days ago. The cardboard was damp, but it was better than sitting directly on the freezing concrete. She placed her backpack on her lap. It wasn't a school bag full of books and homework. It was her life. Inside were the few things she owned, an extra pair of socks that were mostly dry, a small flashlight with fading batteries, a crumpled blanket, and a photograph of 2 people who smiled at the camera. That photo was the only thing that kept her from feeling completely alone in the world, even though looking at it sometimes made the ache in her chest even worse. The city roared around her. Cars splashed through puddles on the street, sending waves of dirty water onto the curb. The sound of horns and sirens was constant, a chaotic noise that most people tuned out. But the girl heard it all. She was hyper-aware of everything. She watched the feet of the passers-by, polished leather shoes, muddy work boots, expensive sneakers with flashing lights. She watched the way people hurried, their heads down, their eyes glued to screens or buried in scarves, desperate to get to their next warm destination. She wondered what it would feel like to be in a hurry to get somewhere warm. She couldn't remember the last time she had been truly warm. It felt like a lifetime ago. Hunger was a familiar feeling, like a difficult roommate she couldn't get rid of. But today, it was screaming louder than usual. It had been 2 days since she had eaten anything substantial. She had found half a granola bar on a park bench yesterday, wrapped in foil. It had been stale and crumbled, but it had tasted like heaven. Today, there was no granola bar. There was only the gnawing emptiness in her stomach that made her feel dizzy and weak. She needed to do something. Sitting in the doorway wasn't going to make the hunger go away. She stood up, her stiff knees protesting. She shouldered her backpack, wincing slightly at the weight of it, though she would never leave it behind. Didn't leave your life behind on a sidewalk. She started walking. She didn't have a destination in mind, just a purpose. She needed to find a place where people might have pity, or where someone might drop a coin, or where she could find a mistake she could benefit from. She walked past a bakery, the smell of fresh bread drifting out through the vents. It was a cruel smell, sweet and yeasty, making her mouth water and her stomach cramp simultaneously. She paused for a second, inhaling deeply, before a worker came out and shooed her away with a broom, not saying a word, just waving the bristles at her like she was a stray dog. She kept walking. The rain started to come down harder, turning into a steady, freezing drizzle. She needed shelter just for a few minutes. Up ahead, she saw the bright lights of a cafe. It looked warm and inviting. Through the large glass windows, she could see orange-yellow lights hanging from the ceiling, steam rising from ceramic mugs, and people sitting on soft chairs. They were eating. She saw plates with sandwiches, soups, and pastries. The girl stopped on the sidewalk. She knew she looked terrible. She could see her reflection in the darkened shop window next to the cafe. Her hair was matted, her face was smeared with dirt, and her clothes were soaked. She knew she didn't belong in there. She knew that usually people like her were invisible, or worse. They were seen as a nuisance. But the hunger was a physical pain now, twisting her insides. She thought about the photograph in her bag. She thought about how her mother used to tell her to be brave. "You are strong," her mother would say. "You can do hard things." She decided to try. She didn't want to beg for money on the corner. That was dangerous and often ignored. She wanted to ask for food directly. It was terrifying. It made her heart hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. She walked toward the cafe door. Her hand trembled as she reached for the handle. She could see people inside laughing and talking, oblivious to the small figure shivering on the other side of the glass. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the nerves that made her feel sick. She wasn't asking for a feast. She wasn't asking for a seat by the fire. She just wanted a simple meal, maybe a roll or a cup of soup. It's anything to stop the shaking. She pushed the door open. A bell chimed pleasantly above her head, announcing her arrival. The noise inside the cafe was a stark contrast to the silence of the street. It was a wall of sound clinking silverware, murmuring voices, the hiss of an espresso machine, as the door swung shut behind her. Cutting off the cold air, the atmosphere in the room seemed to shift instantly. The girl stepped onto the welcome mat, water dripping from her hem onto the floor. She felt 100 pairs of eyes turned toward her. The conversations nearby didn't stop all at once, but they lowered to whispers. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a mixture of shame and fear. She stood there, small and soaking wet, clutching her backpack straps. She felt like she had stepped into a different world, a world where she was definitely not wanted. She looked around for a counter, for someone who looked like they were in charge. She saw a man in a crisp white apron standing near the register. He was wiping down the counter with a cloth, looking efficient and stern. He was the one with the power here. He was the one who decided who got to eat and who got to stay in the cold. The girl's throat felt dry and tight. She knew what was coming, but she had already come this far. She couldn't turn back now. She took a hesitant step forward, her sneakers squeaking on the clean floor, leaving a trail of dirty water prints. She looked at the man, hoping against hope that for just a moment he might see a human being instead of a problem to be solved. The air in the room felt heavy, pressing down on her, waiting for her to speak or for him to act. The distance between her and the counter felt like a mile, but she forced her legs to move, driven by the desperate, simple need for a meal. The man behind the counter stopped wiping the counter the moment he saw her. He didn't smile, and he didn't look confused. He looked annoyed. The rag in his hand froze over a clean spot on the surface, his eyes narrowing as he took in the small, wet figure standing near the entrance. The girl felt like she was suddenly under a spotlight, but not the kind that makes you feel famous. It was the kind that makes you feel like you did something wrong just by existing. She could feel the eyes of the customers burning into her back. They weren't looking at her with kindness. They were looking at her like she was a mess that needed to be cleaned up. She took another deep breath, trying to find her voice. It felt like her throat was closing up, making it hard to swallow. She gripped the straps of her backpack until her knuckles turned white. She needed to ask. She had to ask. "Excuse me?" she whispered. Her voice was so quiet that it was barely audible over the hiss of the coffee machine and the clatter of cups. The man didn't move closer. He just stood there, his arms crossed over his chest, looking down at her from behind the safety of the tall counter. "What do you want?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp. It cut through the warm air of the cafe like a knife. The girl flinched slightly but didn't back away. She looked at the glass display case next to him. Inside, there were rows of sandwiches, pastries, and cookies. They looked perfect. They looked like food from a different world. "I'm really hungry," she stammered, her eyes darting from the food back to the man's face. "I don't have any money. But could I please have something? Anything? Maybe just a roll that you were going to throw away." She waited. In her head, she imagined him smiling. She imagined him saying, "Sure, kid, let me get you a warm meal." She imagined the customers nodding approvingly, happy to see someone being kind. That is what happened in stories, wasn't it? But this wasn't a story. This was real life. The manager let out a long, heavy sigh, like he was the one who was being inconvenienced. He shook his head slowly. "Look," he said, his voice getting harder. "We are not a charity here. People pay for their food. We don't give it away for free." "I know," the girl said quickly, pleading now. "I know. I just haven't eaten in 2 days. Please, just a crust. I'll be quick. I won't bother anyone." She saw a woman sitting at a nearby table look away. The woman took a sip of her coffee and focused intently on her phone, refusing to make eye contact. A man at another table shifted in his seat, looking uncomfortable, but he didn't say anything. The silence in the cafe was heavy. It pressed against the girl's ears. The only sound was the rain tapping on the window behind her, reminding her of the cold world outside. The manager looked around the room. He saw his customers. He saw that they were uncomfortable. He didn't like that. He wanted the peaceful, upscale atmosphere back. He didn't want a dripping wet, dirty child ruining the view for the people who could afford to pay $10 for a sandwich. "You can't stay here," the manager said, pointing a finger toward the glass door. "You're smelling up the place, and you're dripping water on my floor. It's a health hazard." Ick. The girl felt her face burn hot with shame. She knew she smelled like the streets. She knew she was dirty, but she couldn't help it. She looked down at her sneakers, tracing the outline of the mud on the floor with her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'll wipe it up. I just really need food," no, the man said, his voice rising slightly now so that the people near the counter could hear him clearly. He wanted to show them he was handling the problem. "I said no. We don't serve your kind in here. You need to leave now. Your kind." The words hung in the air. The girl didn't know what her kind was. Did he mean hungry people? Did he mean children? Did he mean people who had no home? It didn't matter. The message was clear. She wasn't welcome. She wasn't good enough to stand on the clean floor and breathe the warm air. She looked at him one last time, hoping to see a crack in his armor, a tiny bit of pity in his eyes. But there was nothing. He just looked angry. He gestured aggressively toward the door again. "Go on, get out." "Before I call the police," the threat of the police made her heart jump. She couldn't deal with the police. She had to keep moving. She couldn't let them take her backpack. She couldn't let them separate her from the only thing she had left. The girl turned around slowly. She felt the tears stinging her eyes, threatening to spill over, but she blinked them back. She refused to cry in front of them. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She would not let them see how much it hurt to be treated like trash. She walked toward the door. Every step felt heavy, like her legs were made of lead. She could hear the whispers starting up again behind her back as she walked away. Finally, she heard someone mutter, "Poor thing," another voice whispered. But it was quiet and fearful, not brave enough to stand up to the manager. She reached for the door handle. Her hand was shaking so badly that she almost missed it. She pushed the heavy door open, and the cold wind hit her face instantly. It was a shock after the warmth of the cafe, but it felt honest. The wind didn't pretend to like her and then push her away. The wind was just cold. She stepped out onto the sidewalk. The bell chimed again, a cheerful sound that mocked her as the door swung shut. The lock clicked into place with a final heavy thud. She was outside again. The rain was still falling, harder now. The noise of the traffic rushed back at her honking, engines roaring, tires splashing. She was back in the gray, noisy, lonely world. She stood there for a moment, looking in the window. Inside, the people were already going back to their conversations. They were drinking their coffee and eating their sandwiches. The manager had gone back to wiping the counter, wiping away the invisible dirt she had left behind. It was as if she had never been there at all. The girl felt a sob rise in her throat, but she choked it down. Crying wouldn't get her food. Crying wouldn't make her warm. She pulled her soaked jacket tighter around herself, though it provided no warmth at all. She adjusted her backpack, making sure the straps were secure on her shoulders. She couldn't stay there. If she stood still, the cold would win. She had to move. She turned away from the bright, warm window and started walking down the street. She didn't know where she was going. She just walked. Her shoes were full of water, making a squishing sound with every step. She kept her head down, watching the puddles on the ground, trying to navigate around the deepest ones. The hunger was still there, twisting her stomach, but now there was a new pain in her chest. It was a heavy, hollow feeling that came from being rejected. It was harder to bear than the cold. She felt small. She felt invisible. She walked past a trash can on the corner. She instinctively looked inside, scanning the top layers of rubbish. She saw a coffee cup with a little bit of liquid left in the bottom, and a crumpled up napkin. It was gross. It was humiliating to look through trash, like an animal searching for scraps. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the rim of the bin. But the memory of the manager's angry face flashed in her mind. "We don't serve your kind in here." She pulled her hand back. She couldn't do it. Not today. She had a little bit of dignity left, and she wanted to hold on to it. She kept walking. The streetlights flickered on as the evening sky grew darker. The city was getting ready for the night, but she had nowhere to go. She needed to find a safe spot, somewhere out of the rain, before it got too dark. But the energy had been drained out of her. The confrontation in the cafe had taken the last bit of strength she had. She turned a corner she hadn't been on before. It was a slightly wider street with bigger buildings. In front of her, she saw a large storefront with massive glass windows. It was a high-end department store, the kind that sold expensive suits and sparkling jewelry. The lights were blazing inside, turning the display windows into stages usually. The girl would walk right past a place like that. Stores like that had security guards who would chase her away just for looking too long. But something made her stop. It was a sound, faint and distant. Cutting through the noise of the rain and the traffic, it was music. It wasn't the thumping bass from a car stereo or the blaring music from a bar. It was piano music. It was clear and beautiful, floating out into the street. It sounded sad and hopeful at the same time. The girl stood on the sidewalk, rain dripping off her nose, listening. For a moment, she forgot about the hunger. She forgot about the mean manager. She just listened. The music seemed to pull at something inside her, something that had been buried under the cold and the fear. She looked into the huge window. There, in the middle of the display, surrounded by mannequins wearing fancy clothes, was a grand piano. It was black and shiny, reflecting the spotlights. There was a man sitting at it, playing, his fingers dancing over the keys. The girl couldn't look away. She remembered sitting on a piano bench a long time ago, her feet barely touching the pedals. She remembered the feeling of the keys, smooth and cool. She remembered how playing made her feel like she was flying. Like she could go anywhere and be anything. The memory was so strong it made her dizzy. The man inside the store stood up, bowed to an imaginary audience, and walked away. The piano was left alone in the window. The silence of the street returned, but the echo of the music stayed in her ears. She looked around. The street was quieter here. The security guard who usually stood by the door wasn't there. Through the glass, she saw a maintenance worker walking away from the window, leaving the large side door slightly ajar to let some air in. It was an open door. It was an invitation. Or maybe it was just a mistake. But the girl didn't care. She looked at the piano. It looked like a friend. It looked like the only thing in the city that wasn't cold or mean. She stepped off the curb, ignoring a puddle that soaked her socks, and moved toward the slightly open glass door. She needed to be near that piano. She needed to touch the keys. She didn't know why, but she felt like if she could just play a few notes, the world wouldn't feel so broken anymore. The girl moved closer to the large glass window, her eyes fixed on the instrument inside. The grand piano sat there like a dark, shiny ship in a sea of expensive rugs and bright lights. It looked out of place among the stiff mannequins wearing suits and glittering dresses, yet it seemed more alive than anything else in the display. The rain kept drumming on the sidewalk behind her, trying to pull her back into the misery of the street. Ah! But her feet felt like they were glued to the pavement. She just needed to be closer. She needed to see if it was real. She looked around nervously. The street was busy with people rushing to get out of the rain, their umbrellas bumping into each other. But nobody looked at the dirty girl in the wet jacket staring into the department store window. She was invisible again, which was exactly what she needed. She shifted her backpack to one shoulder, wincing at the weight, and took a small step toward the glass. That was when she saw it. The large glass pane that made up the front of the store wasn't fully shut. The maintenance crew must have left it open just a crack to let some fresh air in, or maybe they forgot to lock it after sweeping. There was a gap, maybe just wide enough for a small person to squeeze through. The girl's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew this was wrong. She knew breaking into a store even, just slipping inside the doorway could get her in big trouble. Her mother had taught her better. But the memory of the manager's angry face flashed in her mind. The hunger was twisting her stomach like a wet towel. She felt like she had nothing left to lose. She looked left, then right. A bus drove past, blocking the view for a second. She used that moment to duck under the metal barricade and slip. Through the gap in the glass, the change in the atmosphere was instant. The howling wind and the cold rain stopped immediately. The sounds of the city became muffled and distant, like they were happening in another world. She was standing on plush, thick carpet. It felt strange under her soaked shoes, soft and yielding. The air inside smelled different too. It smelled like vanilla and expensive wood, a clean, calm smell that made her want to take a deep breath. She stood still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the bright lights. She expected alarms to start blaring. She expected security guards to grab her arm. But the store was quiet. The music overhead was playing soft, gentle jazz. The girl took a few tentative steps deeper into the display area. She felt like an intruder in a museum. Everything around her was so perfect. The shoes on the mannequins were shiny. The silk ties were perfectly straight. And there in the center of it all was the piano. It was a beautiful instrument. It was black polished ebony, reflecting the spotlights like a mirror. The lid was propped open, showing off the strings inside. The keys looked white and perfect, waiting for fingers to bring them to life. The girl walked toward it slowly, as if she were afraid it might disappear if she moved too fast. When she reached the bench, she stopped. She looked down at her hands. They were dirty. Her fingernails had black grit under them. Her skin was red and chapped from the cold. She looked at the pristine keys and then back at her hands. She didn't want to ruin it. She didn't want to stain this beautiful thing with her mess. "Just one touch," she whispered to herself. Her voice sounded tiny in the huge, quiet room. "Just to see how it sounds." She carefully took off her backpack and set it gently on the floor beside the bench. She felt a little lighter without it. She sat down on the bench. It was firm and covered in leather. It was the most comfortable thing she had sat on in a long time. She adjusted her height, lifting her chin, suddenly feeling a familiar sense of posture that she hadn't felt in years. She hovered her hands over the keys. Her mind flashed back to a small, cluttered living room. She saw an old upright piano with chipped ivory keys. She saw a woman with kind hands guiding her fingers. 1, 2, 3, the voice in her memory said. "Feel the music. Don't just play the notes." Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them away. She couldn't cry now. She had to focus. She took a deep breath, ignoring the smell of her own damp clothes, focusing only on the memory of the music. She didn't know if she could still play. It had been so long. Her fingers were stiff from the cold. But the pull was too strong. She reached out and pressed a key. A clear, pure note rang out. It was a low C, deep and resonant. The sound vibrated through the floorboards and up her legs into her chest. It was the most beautiful sound she had heard in a year. She pressed another key, then another. She wasn't playing a song yet, just testing the tone, seeing how the instrument responded to her touch. It felt like the piano was listening to her. It felt like it was waiting for her. She closed her eyes. She let the hunger, the cold, the anger, and the shame float away. She blocked out the image of the cafe manager pointing his finger. She blocked out the rain. In her mind, she was back in that warm living room. She was safe. She was loved. Her fingers found a starting position. They remembered what to do, even if her brain was unsure. She began to play. It started slowly, a simple melody that she remembered from when she was very little. It was a sad song, a song about saying goodbye, but it was also a song about hope. Her left hand found the bass notes, steady and rhythmic. Her right hand began to wander over the higher keys, playing soft, delicate tunes. As she played, she forgot where she was. She forgot she was a homeless girl sitting in a store window. She became just a musician. The music took over. Her cold fingers began to warm up as they moved faster. The song grew more complex. She started adding little trills and runs, notes she hadn't planned, but that just felt right. The piano sang. It filled the empty space of the department store with a sound that was too big for the room. The girl was shaking, but not from the cold anymore. It was an energy that was coming from inside her. It was a release. Every time she hit a chord, she imagined she was pushing her pain out through her fingers and into the strings. The anger at the manager, the fear of the night, the loneliness, it all flowed into the music. The notes weren't just sounds. They were words. They were telling the story of the last year of her life, a story she hadn't been able to say out loud. She leaned into the music, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. The sound was so rich, so full of emotion, that it surprised even her. She didn't know she had this in her anymore. She thought the cold had frozen her talent along with her toes. But it was there, buried deep. Waiting for a moment like this, she didn't notice the people outside, because the front of the store was all glass. The sidewalk was like a theater. The rain was still falling, but the glow from the window was like a beacon. A man walking his dog stopped. He heard the music and looked up from his phone. He saw the small, ragged figure sitting at the grand piano, surrounded by luxury goods. He stopped walking. The dog sat down, tilting its head at the sound. A woman with a shopping bag paused to adjust her umbrella. She turned toward the window and saw the girl. She froze. The contrast was shocking. The girl looked so out of place, yet she looked so serious, so focused. The music drifting through the glass was hauntingly beautiful. It wasn't just noise. It was art. More people began to stop. One by one, the rushing commuters paused. They saw the crowd gathering and wondered what was happening. When they heard the music, they understood the girl played on, lost in her own world. She was playing a complex piece now, something she had practiced 1,000 times on that old upright piano. She didn't need to look at the keys. Her hands knew the way. She poured her soul into every note, playing the sadness she felt, but also the strength she had found to survive another day on the streets. The sound floated out onto the rainy street. Cutting through the noise of the traffic, it was a magnet. People pulled out their phones, not to mock, but to capture something magical. They filmed the small child in the dirty jacket, creating beauty in a world that had been so ugly to her. Inside the store, the girl didn't see the faces pressed against the glass. She didn't see the tears in the eyes of some of the onlookers. She just heard the music. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was home. The music grew louder, filling the space not just inside the store, but spilling out onto the wet sidewalk like an invisible wave. The girl was no longer in a brightly lit department store. She was in a world of her own making. Her eyes were closed tight, shutting out the mannequins, the expensive jewelry, and the reality of her dirty clothes. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she could see the notes hanging in the air, colorful and vivid. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but the mood of the street had changed completely. The harsh, hurried rhythm of the city was being overpowered by the sound of the piano. A man in a business suit, who had been running to catch a bus, stopped dead in his tracks when he heard the melody. It wasn't the sound of street performers banging on buckets or playing a scratched violin. This was different. It was profound. It pulled at something deep inside him that made him forget about his meeting and his wet shoes. He looked into the window and saw the source of the sound. He saw the small, hunched figure on the bench. He saw the dripping backpack on the floor. The contrast between the elegance of the music and the roughness of the girl's appearance was shocking. He stood there, his mouth slightly open, watching the girl's thin fingers fly over the keys. She wasn't just hitting notes. She was attacking them with a passion that seemed too big for her small body. The man wasn't the only one who had stopped. A woman carrying 3 heavy shopping bags paused to adjust her umbrella. She heard the haunting tune and turned her head. When she saw the child playing, her expression softened. She put her bags down on the dry pavement under an awning, just to listen. She saw the way the girl's body swayed with the music, how her shoulders relaxed and tensed with the flow of the song. It looked like the girl was pouring her entire life into those keys. More people gathered. It started as a handful, but within minutes, a small crowd had formed along the glass window. People standing in line for the bus nearby craned their necks to see. Taxi drivers slowed down as they passed, slowing their wipers to catch a glimpse of the scene. The glass, which was usually a barrier between the store and the street, now acted like a stage. The city was the audience, and the homeless girl was the star. Inside the store, the girl had no idea she was being watched. She was playing a complex piece that flowed from a dark, heavy sadness into a rising, hopeful crescendo. Her fingers moved with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for a child, who had been shivering in the cold just moments ago. The cold was still there, nipping at her toes and her nose, but the adrenaline rushing through her veins kept her warm. She felt powerful. For the first time in a year, she wasn't the victim. She wasn't the helpless kid who got kicked out of a cafe. She was the creator of this beautiful sound. She was in control. The song she was playing wasn't a famous pop song or a simple nursery rhyme. It was a masterpiece of emotion. The notes were high and crystal clear, like raindrops hitting a tin roof, then low and rumbling like thunder in the distance. She played a series of chords that were so full of emotion that a woman in the crowd outside actually wiped a tear from her cheek. "She is incredible," a man whispered to his wife, breaking the silence of the watchers. "Look at her shoes," the wife whispered back. "She has nothing. How can she play like that?" People pulled out their phones. Cameras flashed, reflecting in the glass. But the girl didn't notice the lights. She was in the final intense part of the song. Her hands were moving so fast they were almost a blur. She was pouring all her hunger, all her loneliness, and all her anger into the music. It was a raw, unfiltered cry from her soul, translated into sound. The pain of the morning, the soreness in her legs from walking all day, the stinging memory of the manager's rejection it all flowed out of her, fingertips and into the piano. The grand piano seemed to respond to her. It sang back to her, amplifying her feelings, surrounding her with a wall of sound that protected her from the world. The vibrations traveled up the bench and into her bones, making her feel like she was part of the instrument. The crowd outside grew larger. The sidewalk was blocked now, but nobody seemed to mind waiting. There was a silent agreement among the strangers that this was a special moment that shouldn't be interrupted. They weren't looking at a homeless girl anymore. They were looking at a prodigy. They were witnessing a moment of pure, unadulterated human spirit. In a city where everyone usually rushed past each other, ignoring their neighbors, they were united by the music of a child they had never met, a teenager in a hoodie, who had been leaning against the wall looking bored, stood up straight and took his headphones off. He stared at the girl's hands, mesmerized by the movement. He knew how hard it was to play piano. He had quit lessons after 2 months because it was too difficult. Seeing this girl who looked like she hadn't slept in a bed for weeks, playing with such skill made him feel quiet and respectful. The girl's breathing became heavy as she reached the climax of the song. Her heart was racing, matching the rhythm of the music. She could feel the energy building up inside her, ready to explode. She struck the keys harder, the sound booming through the large room, shaking the dust motes, dancing in the spotlight beams. She was playing for her parents, imagining they were there in the room with her, smiling and nodding. She was playing for the people who had ignored her, showing them what she was capable of. She was playing for herself, to remind herself that she was still alive, that she still had worth. The tension in the music was undeniable. The crowd outside leaned in closer, their breath fogging up the glass. They were holding their breath without realizing it. The girl hit a long run of notes, cascading down the keyboard like a waterfall. Her left hand pounding out the foundation, then slowly the music began to change. It moved from the chaotic, stormy intensity into a gentle, calm resolution. The notes became softer. The pace slowed down. The anger was gone, replaced by a sense of peace. It was like the sun coming out after a storm. The girl's hands slowed down. She played a final, gentle chord. Letting the notes linger in the air, she lifted her hands off the keys. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Inside the store, the echo of the last note faded away, leaving just the sound of the girl's ragged breathing. Outside on the street, the silence was even more profound. For a second, no cars honked. No one spoke. The city held its breath, processing what they had just heard. The girl sat on the bench, her shoulders slumping forward as the adrenaline left her body. The exhaustion came rushing back. Her hands were trembling, not from cold this time, but from the effort of playing. She stared at the keys, which were no longer shiny and perfect. They were dusty now, marked by her touch. She felt a wave of sadness wash over her as the music stopped. The beautiful world she had created in her mind vanished, and she was back in the department store. She slowly opened her eyes. She expected to see the empty fake room. She expected to see the dark window. But as her vision cleared, she saw something else. She saw the glass. And pressed against the glass, covering the entire window, were faces. The girl froze. Her heart stopped. For a terrifying second, she thought they were angry. She thought the police were there. She thought the security guards had come to lock her up. Her body tensed, ready to run, to grab her backpack and flee into the night. But she didn't move. She looked closer at the people. They weren't angry. They were staring. Their eyes were wide. Some of them had their hands over their mouths. Others were wiping tears from their eyes. They looked amazed. Then, a sound broke the silence. A man near the front of the crowd, the one in the business suit, started to clap. It was a slow, deliberate clap. Then another person joined in. Then a woman. Then the teenager in the hoodie. Within seconds, the silence shattered. Applause erupted on the sidewalk. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was loud, thunderous cheering. People were whistling and shouting, "Bravo!" The sound washed over the girl, warm and welcoming, completely different from the cold wind she was used to. She sat there, stunned, her hands resting on her lap, watching the crowd cheer for her through the glass. The girl who had been refused a simple meal, the girl who had been told she didn't belong, was now getting a standing ovation from the city. The sound of the applause was deafening, but it wasn't the scary kind of noise the girl was used to. It wasn't shouting or sirens or the angry voice of a security guard. It was warm and rhythmic, washing over the glass like a wave. The girl sat frozen on the piano bench, her hands hovering over the keys, her eyes wide with shock. For a minute, she couldn't move. She looked at the sea of faces pressed against the window. They were smiling. Some were wiping their eyes. They were looking at her, not through her. They were clapping for her. Her heart hammered against her ribs. But this time it wasn't from fear. It was a confusing mix of relief, shock, and a tiny, flickering feeling of pride she hadn't felt in a very long time. She gave a small, shy nod, acknowledging the crowd. But inside she was terrified. The music was over. The magic bubble had burst. Now, she was just a dirty kid in a store she wasn't allowed to be in. Suddenly, the heavy thud of boots running on the carpet made her jump. The smile vanished from her face. She saw two security guards rushing toward her from the back of the store. They looked big and intimidating in their uniforms, with radios on their shoulders and serious expressions. The girl's stomach dropped. She knew it. The fun was over. They were going to yell at her. They were going to grab her and throw her back out into the rain. Maybe this time they would call the police. She instinctively grabbed her backpack, pulling it onto her lap like a shield. Bracing herself for the shouting, she scrunched her eyes shut, waiting for the rough hands on her shoulder. But the hands never came. Instead, a deep, booming voice spoke, not with anger, but with breathless amazement. "Kid, do you have any idea how good you are?" The girl opened one eye slowly. The guard was standing right in front of her, but he wasn't reaching for her. He had his hands on his hips, looking down at her with a look of total disbelief. He glanced back at the window where the crowd was still cheering and taking photos, then looked at her again. "I'm sorry," the girl stammered, her voice shaking. "I didn't mean to break in. I just wanted to play. I'll leave. I'm sorry. Leave." "Are you kidding?" the guard said, a small smile cracking his serious face. "You just stopped traffic on a Tuesday night. Look at them." He pointed to the window. "They love you. You aren't in trouble. Not even close." Just then, the glass door behind the girl swung open. A gust of cold air rushed in, along with a woman who looked like she had run a marathon. She was dressed in an elegant coat and had a scarf wrapped loosely around her neck, but her hair was messy from the wind. She wasn't a customer or a security guard. She was the store's featured pianist. She had been on her break in a coffee shop next door when she heard the commotion and saw the crowd gathering outside. Her own workplace. She rushed over to the piano, ignoring the wet footprints the girl had left on the carpet. She didn't look at the girl with pity or disgust. She looked at her the way a miner looks at a diamond. She looked at her with pure respect. "Who taught you that piece?" the woman asked, her voice urgent but kind. The girl looked down at her dirty sneakers. "My mom, a long time ago. Before she got sick? Before we lost the house? Before I was alone?" The words stuck in her throat, but the woman seemed to understand. She didn't push for more details. She just nodded slowly. "Your technique is raw, but you're feeling. It's perfect," the woman said softly. She knelt down on the carpet next to the piano bench, bringing herself to the girl's eye level. This close, the woman could smell the rain and the street on the girl, but she didn't pull away. She reached out and gently took the girl's cold, dirty hands in her own warm ones. The girl flinched slightly, expecting to be pushed away, but the woman held on tight. "You have a gift," the woman said, looking straight into the girl's eyes. "A gift that most people practice for 20 years and never get. You cannot let this go. You cannot let the world silence this." The girl felt a lump form in her throat so big she couldn't swallow. "But I'm hungry," she whispered, the truth slipping out before she could stop it. "And I'm cold." The woman's face changed instantly. The awe turned into a fierce protectiveness. She stood up and looked at the security guard. "Is the staff room free?" she asked him. "Yes, ma'am." The guard replied immediately. "I'll unlock it." "Good," the woman said. She turned back to the girl. "What is your name?" "Maya," the girl whispered. It felt strange to say her name out loud again. It felt like remembering who she used to be. "Well, Maya," the woman said, gently squeezing her shoulder, "I am not going to let you walk back out into that rain. Not tonight. You are coming with me." The woman helped Maya off the bench. Maya grabbed her backpack, clutching it tightly. She felt like she was dreaming. This kind of thing didn't happen in real life. In real life, you got kicked out of cafes. In real life, you slept in doorways. You didn't get rescued by a pianist after playing a song. The woman led her past the mannequins and through a door marked staff only. The guard held the door open for them. Tipping his hat at Maya as she walked by, inside the back room, it was quieter. The woman immediately took off her own expensive coat and draped it around Maya's small shoulders. It was heavy and warm, and it smelled like lavender. It was the warmest thing Maya had felt in years. "Sit here," the woman said, guiding Maya to a soft chair in the break room. "I'll be right back." The woman left the room for a moment. Maya sat there, sinking into the chair, the coat wrapped tight around her. She looked around the small room. There was a microwave, a coffee machine, and a table with chairs. It was just a normal break room, but to Maya, it looked like a palace. It was dry. It was safe. She listened to the sound of her own breathing, trying to calm down. A few minutes later, the woman came back. She wasn't empty-handed. She had a tray with a steaming bowl of soup, a thick sandwich, and a cup of hot chocolate with marshmallows floating on top. The smell hit Maya instantly, and her stomach let out a loud growl. She felt her face turn red, but the woman just laughed kindly. She set the tray down on the table in front of Maya. She said simply, "Take your time. There is plenty." Maya didn't need to be told twice. She picked up the spoon, her hand still shaking a little, and took a sip of the soup. It was hot and rich, filling her up immediately. It tasted better than anything she had ever remembered eating. Tears began to spill out of her eyes and splash into the soup, but she kept eating. She couldn't stop. The woman sat down opposite her, watching with a gentle smile, not saying a word, just letting the girl eat. When Maya had finished the soup and half the sandwich, she finally slowed down. She looked up at the woman. "Why?" Maya asked. "Why are you being nice to me? Nobody else is." The woman sighed and leaned forward. "Because I heard you play, Maya. When you play, you tell the truth. And the truth is beautiful. The world needs to hear that truth. I'm not going to let a talent like yours waste away on the street. The woman reached into her purse and pulled out a card, but she didn't give it to Maya right away. She looked at the girl thoughtfully. I have an idea, she said. I teach at a music academy across town. We have scholarships. We have dormitories where it is warm and there is food. I can't promise anything, but if you are willing to work hard, maybe I can get you an audition. Maya's eyes went wide. A school? For music? A place to sleep that wasn't a doorway? It sounded impossible, but I don't have a home, and I don't have nice clothes. You can figure that out, the woman said firmly. One step at a time. Tonight, you eat and you get warm. Tomorrow, we go from there. The rest of the night passed in a warm blur. The woman, whose name Maya learned was Eleanor, didn't let her go back outside. She made some phone calls, speaking in a low, serious voice. When she hung up, she told Maya that she had spoken to a friend who ran a youth shelter nearby, a safe place where Maya could stay for the night. Eleanor promised to pick her up first thing in the morning to take her to the academy. Later, Eleanor walked Maya out of the store. The rain had finally stopped. The streets were wet and shining under the streetlights. The crowd outside had dispersed, but a few people were still lingering, hoping to catch another glimpse of the mystery pianist as Maya walked out. Wearing Eleanor's coat and with her belly full of food, a few people recognized her. They didn't look away this time. They smiled. A man walking by tipped his hat. A woman gave her a thumbs up. Maya felt her back straighten. She wasn't invisible anymore. Eleanor walked her to the shelter, which was only a few blocks away. It was a clean brick building with a light over the door. Before Eleanor left, she knelt down one last time. Don't forget what you did in there tonight, Maya. You didn't just play a song. You reminded a lot of people that beauty can come from anywhere. Maya hugged the coat tight around herself. She looked back at the street corner where she had been sitting just hours before, cold and hungry. It felt like a million years ago. She looked at Eleanor and nodded. I won't forget, she said, as Maya walked into the shelter. Leaving the cold night behind her, she knew the road ahead would still be hard. She didn't have a magic wand to fix everything instantly. But for the first time in a long time, she had hope. She had a full stomach, a warm coat, and a promise of a future. And she had the music. As long as she had the music, she knew she would be okay. The girl who had been refused a meal was finally going to eat.